Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. The last time I gave a talk at Oxford was to what was then the Hayek Society, which used to be this particular organisation. And I gave a talk then which was called Against Democratic Fundamentalism, a Public Choice Critique. Now, you might get the impression, given the title of my talk today is Democracy and the Deliberative Conceit, that I'm not a great fan of democracy. And you'd be absolutely right to get that impression for reasons which will be revealed throughout this particular talk. One of the most important arguments that's often raised against classical liberalism, a sort of free market view of society, if you like, is that it has an impoverished understanding of the relationship between the individual on the one hand and society and the social environment on the other hand. There are two dimensions to these kind of criticisms. One of them is based on the notion that classical liberalism subscribes to a view of the individual as essentially an isolated agent, an agent that doesn't actually have any kind of social connections. This is epitomised in the idea of people as being individual, selfish, utility maximizers. And also the notion that people are essentially, as individuals, preformed before they come into the social world. That their preferences, the way that they are as people, is pre-given before they enter into social arrangements. The second dimension of the criticism of classical liberalism is that the kind of institutions that classical liberals advocate, markets in particular, actually reinforce this faulty notion of the individual. So they perpetuate selfish behaviour and they perpetuate a sense of estrangement from the social environment. Now, out of these criticisms, we get proposals for alternative forms of decision-making, which are considered to be more in tune with the true nature of the relationship between the individual on the one hand and the social on the other. And these are often manifested in arguments for what is known as deliberative democracy. People who subscribe to this view, who I loosely describe as communitarians of various persuasions, claim that individuals are socially situated actors who acquire their preferences and values from the social environment, and that the institutions that we use for decision-making should reinforce this socially situated nature of the individual. That institutions should be more communicative. This is the term which is often used in this context. Now, what I want to do in this talk is to show that classical liberalism, first of all, is not guilty of subscribing to this asocial or antisocial, you might say, view of the individual self that the communitarians, the deliberative Democrats, claim. And secondly, I want to show that if you actually subscribe to the view of the individual that deliberative Democrats have, which I think you should do, you don't end up supporting democratic institutions, you should end up supporting the institutions of a classical liberal society and market institutions in particular. Now, in order to make this case, I'm going to divide my remarks into three parts. I'll start off by sketching out in a little bit more detail the substance of this deliberativist critique, as I'll describe it, of classical liberalism. The second part of the talk, I'll set out what I consider to be the classical liberal understanding of the relationship between the individual and society. And I'll be focusing on Hayek's notion of true individualism, what he describes as true individualism, as opposed to a false notion of individualism. The third part of the talk, which itself will have several subsections, I will use to demonstrate how a market economy based on the principle of exit is more likely to fulfill the kind of goals that deliberative Democrats advocate than deliberative democratic institutions. Okay, so first of all, let's start off with the leftist deliberative democratic critique of liberalism. Now, there are a number of writers who I think can be described as advocating this kind of criticism in one way or another. Alistair MacIntyre might be one. Jurgen Habermas is certainly someone who subscribes to these kind of views. People who popularised these notions in the context of political theory, I would mention the late Iris Marion Young as an example, John Dryzek, and Chantal Mouffe. These are all people who, one way or another, subscribe to a deliberative notion of democracy, although there are some nuances between the various perspectives that they put forward. Some of them call themselves deliberative Democrats, others call themselves radical Democrats. Now, what is the basis of the arguments that they make? Well, first of all, they make the claim that classical liberals have a faulty understanding of the individual self. According to this critique, classical liberalism subscribes to a view which sees individuals as existing as selves with preferences and values which are essentially independent of social identity, that people come into the world as preformed agents with a particular set of preferences in particular, almost genetically determined preferences. You could almost see it in that kind of a way. On this view, people are free also to define a personalised conception of the good life, which is basically independent of the social circumstances in which people find themselves. Now, what is wrong with this view, according to the deliberativist critics of liberalism, holding to this kind of a view of the individual? Well, one argument is, a very important argument, is that it undermines the basis for any kind of social morality. It reduces morality purely to a matter of individual preferences. In this kind of context, it claims, you have no stability to any kind of moral values. Even the kind of institutions that liberalism supports, such as private property, respect for private property rights, will be chronically unstable in a society in which you just treat people's support for moral values merely as a private preference, as opposed to something which transcends the preferences of individual actors. So that's the first criticism that's made. The second criticism, which is related, is the notion that classical liberalism has no notion whatsoever of the common good. It sees society purely as an aggregate of these individuals who have these preformed set of values and preferences. Insofar as it conceives of the common good at all, it purely sees that common good as being an aggregate of these different individual values. Now, what's wrong with this kind of aggregative view? Well, there are a number of criticisms which are raised. The first criticism that's raised is the notion that an aggregate notion of social welfare in this sense is incompatible with the recognition that certain moral values are incommensurable. They're conflicting in a radical way, and you can't add them up to come up with some kind of aggregative figure of social welfare. You're talking about trying to add up apples and oranges, in a sense. When we're talking about moral conflicts about what is right and wrong, the notion of aggregating these different values is seen to be conceptually incoherent. What you need in these circumstances is a context in which people engage with one another as concerned citizens through some kind of argumentative process, and they decide through the process of argument what is morally right and what is morally wrong. There isn't any suggestion here that conflicts necessarily will go away, although some people who are within this tradition do emphasize the notion of consensus building. But the claim is that argument, rather than aggregation, is more appropriate to the fundamental nature of moral conflicts. Another aspect of this criticism is the claim that because classical liberals assume that people come into the world with a pre-given set of preferences, and that the function of institutions is merely to aggregate these preferences, that this acts to entrench various forms of oppression and exclusion within society. So, according to this view, people will have a fixed view of what it means, for example, to be a woman, of what it means to be a poor person, of what it means to be a gay person, of what it means to be a member of some kind of ethnic or religious minority. That people's views on what these notions of identity mean are fixed and preformed. If people have prejudices about the people who are members of these various categories, if you like, they will merely be reflected by aggregative institutions. There will be no sense in which the views that people hold about what the appropriate role of women is, the moral status of gay people or of poor people or of other excluded groups, there's no sense in which those views that people have about these people can be challenged in some sense. That what are essentially prejudices, or what should be seen as prejudices, won't be challenged in the appropriate way. They'll simply be reflected by these aggregated institutions. So what we need is a set of institutions which challenge preferences and values that people hold, rather than simply taking them as a given fact of the social environment. Now, from the critical perspective, from the deliberativist critical perspective, what's doubly worrying about classical liberalism, apart from this faulty notion of the individual that it subscribes to, is that the institutions that it advocates to deal with social problems actually reinforce this defective notion of the self. We can see all of these errors, if you like, within institutions such as markets. So markets, on this critical perspective, don't recognise that people are socially situated agents. They treat people merely as isolated individuals who have a preformed set of preferences. That markets simply respond to these preferences rather than ever actually challenging the content of the values that people actually hold. Secondly, markets have got no conception whatsoever of the common good, no sense of what is in the collective weal, other than seeing it purely in terms of an aggregate of the individual preferences that people happen to have. In this context, markets are seen to discourage social learning. Instead of people learning from one another, challenging one another's preferences and values, you actually have a chronic disengagement from critical public discourse, and people just retreat to their own private, bourgeois, suburban type of life, if you like, which isn't engaged in some kind of critical moral dialogue. Markets also, it's argued, reinforce social exclusion. If people are just acting according to these pre-given preferences rather than having their prejudices challenged, then markets will reproduce relations of inequality that exist within society in terms of attitudes to women, poor people, black people, members of other minority groups, etc., etc. So what then is the alternative to these dehumanizing market processes that classical liberals advocate? Well, the claim is that we should support institutions of deliberative democracy, or radical democracy, as it's sometimes known. The alternative to markets, argue these critics, is not some kind of bureaucratic central planning apparatus. It's not the nightmare of some kind of Soviet system where bureaucrats take decisions on behalf of everybody in a very kind of authoritarian way. Rather, it's a much more decentralized process of participatory democratic rule. Participatory democracy is the type of institution that we should favour over both markets on the one hand and central economic planning or central social planning on the other hand. Now, what would an ideal form of deliberative democracy look like? Well, if it meets the requirements of what Habermas describes as an ideal speech situation, the perfect form of deliberative democracy, if you like, it will be a regime in which anybody who is affected by a public decision, and in this account, pretty well all decisions are considered to be public in some sense, having public effect. Anybody who is affected by a decision has an equal right to take part in the making of that decision. So anything that affects you in any way, in terms of a decision which is made by a private enterprise, by a social group, whatever it may be, you have a right to participate in that decision. What form will this participation take? Well, it will be a form of participatory democracy in which decisions are made according to some form of majoritarian decision-making. So participatory democracy and decisions actually made when there's some kind of disagreement going on, if we haven't reached unanimity, through majority rule. Now, how will the decisions of the majority be formed? Well, again, in the context of the ideal speech situation, what will determine the decisions that are made will not necessarily be the numbers of people who support one view or another, but rather they will reflect what Habermas calls or describes as the unforced power of the better argument. So the assumption is that whoever has the best arguments to give will command the necessary support. It's not simply that people go in and whoever has the most preferences on their side to start off with, that's then reflected in the decision. The point is supposed to be of this exercise that people's preferences will be challenged, and whoever comes out with the best argument to challenge people's preferences, that will sway people in the appropriate direction. The unforced power of the better argument. If you're being a bit cynical about this, as I will be later on, believe me, it's a kind of glorified academic seminar view of the way decisions should be made. Now, if decisions are made in this way, the argument is, instead of public policy being something which is done to the public through some kind of central planning apparatus, bureaucrats imposing their views on people, instead, public policy will be something that comes from the public itself. The public themselves will be generating the public decisions that affect them in this ideal speech type of scenario. Now, what are the arguments which are advanced in favour of this? Well, there are two which I'm going to be focusing on. There's what I would describe as an epistemological argument, which is the claim that decisions which conform to these kind of criteria are better decisions. They're more rational decisions in some sense. And then there's also a moral argument, which is the claim that decisions which are made in this way are more ethical in some sense than decisions which are made in a market-type context. What's the epistemic argument? Well, the argument here is, if you put people into this ideal speech situation, or at least institutions which approximate it in some way, you will get people thinking about the collective good. Instead of people thinking about their own narrow individual interests, you will create a more socialized conception of the self, in which people are thinking consciously about what is in the good of the society, or what is in the good of the community, rather than bargaining on the basis of their own preformed individual interests. So a more holistic view of decision-making is the kind of argument that you often get put forward here. The claim is that decisions will be more holistic, that they'll be more rational, because everybody's interests will be taken into account in some kind of process of collective reasoning. Secondly, it's claimed that these kind of institutions of participatory democracy, where the emphasis is on argument, will promote learning, that there'll be more learning that goes on in these kind of environments, because we're challenging people's preferences rather than taking them as pre-given and fixed. People will engage with one another and start to appreciate points of view which go beyond themselves. So you'll get a much richer sense of rationality emerging from this kind of process, where people are collaborating with one another in some sense of common endeavour, as opposed to a situation where people are bargaining as isolated individuals. What about the moral argument? Well, the moral argument is that these kind of institutions of participatory deliberation are more ethical. They're closer attuned to notions of justice and equality than are institutions such as markets, which are based on bargaining and therefore various power inequalities. The claim is that these kind of institutions are more likely to reflect the values of socially excluded groups, groups which have had some forms of oppression or prejudice exercised against them at some point in human history. Thirdly, it's argued morally that although some of the conflicts around identity and values that are likely to persist in society are not going to be overcome, people aren't necessarily, even if we have these kind of institutions, going to be able to come to understand one another. They will, because they've engaged in a process of argumentation, learn to show more respect for other points of view. So these institutions encourage greater respect for the other. This is the term which is often used in this context. So you don't get rid of conflict, But in a situation where there is conflict, you encourage people to be more respectful of one another, as opposed to a situation that you might have in markets where those with the greatest power are just able to bargain into what they personally want. Okay, so those are the elements of this argument for deliberative democracy and arguments against classical liberalism. Now, it seems to me many of these arguments have actually got a lot to say for them. This kind of view of the individual as a socially situated being, it seems to me as much more realistic than the kind of view of the individual that you often get depicted in, for example, rational choice theory, various versions of utilitarianism, or in social contract theory. All of the political theories which assume that people are essentially rational agents, that they're self-interested agents, agents that come into the world with an unchanging sense of what it is that they want, a fixed sense of the self. It seems to me all of the criticisms which are raised against this kind of view of the individual are absolutely spot on the mark. The problem that the deliberative Democrats have is the normative conclusions they reach from this understanding of the self. In my view, it's a complete non sequitur to go from recognizing that people are these socially situated agents whose sense of identity is actually fluid rather than fixed, is socially situated rather than purely individual. It's a non sequitur to go from this understanding of the individual to the conclusion that deliberative democracy is the most appropriate institution to deal with this social reality. What I want to show you is that we can accept this understanding of the self that deliberative Democrats have, but end up by actually reinforcing the argument not for deliberative democracy, but for classical liberal institutions based on markets and the exit principle. So this is an argument for exit-based institutions rather than voice-based institutions. I'm going to do this in three subsections. First of all, I'm going to describe what I consider to be the classical liberal understanding of the self, properly understood, and then I'll go on to show how this understanding of the self counts against the arguments for deliberative democracy. Okay, how do classical liberals understand the relationship between the individual and society? Well, here I want to emphasize, in tune with Hayek's notion of true individualism, classical liberalism is explicit in recognizing that people are the product, to a significant extent, they are the product of their social circumstances, of their social environment. The preferences that people have, the values and beliefs that people have, the norms that they subscribe to are not, to a very significant extent, self-generated. They are acquired characteristics, characteristics which people acquire from the social environment, from the socio-cultural environment in which they are born. Now, Hayek claims, having recognized this, that what identifies individuals as social beings is their incapacity to comprehend more than a tiny fragment of the social environment in which they are situated. Now, why is that? It's because human beings are chronically, on Hayek's view, limited in their cognitive capacities. There is only so much information that the individual human brain can process. As a consequence of these cognitive limitations, we can never perceive more than a small part of the environment which actually creates us and molds us in various ways. Now, it follows from this point about cognitive limitations, but also recognizing that people are part of their social environment, that although people are part of the social environment, it doesn't follow that that environment is somehow the deliberate creation of some individual or group. The social environment, on Hayek's view, should be seen as a kind of evolutionary process. What we call the social environment, what affects us, arises as the unintended consequence of the interaction between various individuals. So the social norms, the beliefs, the values, the traditions that we subscribe to, they're not purely of our own creation. They emerge as the unintended consequence of interactions between various individuals. Now, the ultimate example of this spontaneous order type view of society is the institution of language. Language is a profoundly social phenomenon. We don't invent our own language when we participate in speech acts. In most situations, we are unaware of who the people were who initiated the words and phrases which we use as a matter of common usage. We don't know who the inventors of these particular words and phrases were. It's part of our social environment. It determines us in some sense, but we are not aware of where this environment actually came from, of who invented it as such. Equally, we are not aware of how our own actions in society will modify that environment. Every time we engage in speech with other people, we come up with new words and phrases. We are not aware of what the effect of those words and phrases will be on the social environment. Other individuals who hear us speaking or who hear us giving certain arguments may interpret and act on those arguments in ways which we haven't anticipated. So our arguments, our participation in speech, will itself have unintended consequences. So we are not aware of where our language comes from, but we're also not fully aware of how our participation in language will affect the evolution of the linguistic structure of which we are part. That's a fundamental point that Hayek claims follows from this recognition that we are socially situated agents, but crucially, that we are all cognitively limited agents. The case of language is the ultimate example where we are all both determined by our social environment, in a sense. We are a product of our language, the language that we're born into, but we are simultaneously, as individuals, challenging that environment at the margin. We play around with words, we invent new phrases, we come up with new forms of meaning at the margin. So we're both affected by our social environment, but at the same time we affect that environment in all kinds of unanticipated ways. Now, given this understanding of the relationship between the individual and society, what is important from a classical liberal view? What matters from a classical liberal perspective is that if we're going to get the most from human rationality, then we have to think about which kind of institutions and which kind of social processes provide the maximum scope for our rationality to evolve in the most complex possible way. What kind of institutions maximize the room for evolution to take place? Now, the claim here is that spontaneous orders, orders which arise not through any deliberate act of planning, such as language, for example, are superior to planned or designed orders. Why are spontaneous orders, orders which are not the product of anybody's deliberate intention, seen to be superior? Well, there are two reasons. First of all, given that we're cognitively limited, central planners, if you like, cannot know about all of the circumstances which are pertinent to the most appropriate evolution of social norms. Someone who tried to plan a language simply wouldn't know how to plan it effectively, because they wouldn't be aware of all the different circumstances that affect lots of individual participants in the language on the ground. There'll be things that those participants in the language, in the speech community, know about, but that some central designer of language simply wouldn't be aware of, because just like anybody else, they're limited in their cognitive capacities. Even the smartest, the most intelligent people are relatively stupid when it comes to the overall environment in which they're actually situated. Secondly, a planned order will stifle scope for experimental evolution. In a spontaneous order such as language, all the different individual speech participants are potential nodes of experimentation, people who will be playing around with the rules of language in lots of different ways. In an environment where we've got lots of different decision makers contributing to the social decision-making process, we're maximising the size of the gene pool from which successful experiments in language or communication might actually arise or be chosen. If we rely on some kind of central planning apparatus, then only the ideas of the planners will be fed into this gene pool. The gene pool will be much thinner than if we rely on a more decentralised process. Now, on this view, on the view that I'm expressing so far, we have an alternative way of considering market institutions. Markets, in many ways, on the classical liberal understanding, are very similar to the process of linguistic evolution. They provide, on the one hand, a degree of regularity in people's lives, which enables people to coordinate their actions without there being some central agent in control. And they do that through the price system. The price system is people responding to signals which are generated through multiple acts of buying and selling, enables people to adjust their behaviour, for example, economising on goods which have become more expensive, or using more of goods which have become relatively cheaper. Coordination is achieved by responding to price signals without people needing to be aware of all the circumstances which contribute to those price signals. So we have an order arising, the same way we have an order in language, even though people are unaware of it, even though nobody is in control. The advantage of a market from a classical liberal point of view is that no central planner could ever be aware of all of the circumstances which affect the scarcity of different goods, in the same way that no central planner could ever be aware of all of the circumstances that affect the evolution of language. That's point one. The second thing to emphasise about markets on this view is that markets are an environment in which evolution takes place. The institution of private property in a market economy, on a classical liberal view, facilitates the exercise by lots of different individual owners of property an independence of decision which allows them to experiment with various decisions in a way that wouldn't be possible where all of their decisions subject to the rule of some central hierarchy. We can have more genes being contributed to the gene pool in the sense of ideas that different property owners have about what should be produced, how the goods should be produced, and in what quantities. More ideas will be fed into the mix in a decentralised system based on private property than would be the case if there is a central decision maker making all of the decisions. So you get a richer process of social evolution, of learning taking place, and an environment where you have dispersed ownership of property, where the individual owners have decision rights rather than some kind of central agency. The final thing to emphasise before I move on to my criticisms of deliberative democracy is that classical liberalism on this view does have an understanding of the common good, which is about much more than an aggregate of individual values. It's about allowing the process of evolution to take place, an evolutionary process which increases the chance that things which turn out to be in the common good have the possibility of being discovered. Precisely because it's a decentralised system, where lots of different experiments can be tried out, rather than a more centralised system, you are increasing the possibility for good things to arise. There's no guarantee of it, because evolution always involves mistakes. But by having a decentralised system, you increase the chance that good ideas in both economics and in morals can actually be discovered through this kind of process of decentralised evolution. Okay, so that's my understanding of what classical liberalism and its understanding of the self is about. I want to turn now to apply these ideas to the criticism of deliberative democracy, to show why deliberative democracy is actually just about the last form of decision-making that we should actually be relying on if we hold to this view of the self as a fluid, evolving kind of notion. First of all, I want to criticise the epistemological argument in favour of deliberation. Remember, this is the argument that if we have collective deliberation, we get more rational or better decisions arising. This view is based on a complete non sequitur. It's based on the idea that because society is more than the sum of its individual parts, that somehow we should have collective decision-making. If you take the Hayekian view, it's precisely because society is more than the sum of its individual parts that we shouldn't have collective decision-making. Why? Because the collective can never comprehend all of the factors which contribute to its own advance. The collective can never know all of the factors which will contribute to its own evolution. Now, this analysis applies even if we grant the most ridiculous, I would suggest, concessions to deliberative Democrats. In an ideal speech situation, in the Habermasian fantasy land, everybody who's affected by a decision should have a right to participate. Now, suspend disbelief and imagine that somehow we could bring this situation about, that we could hire out multiple Wembley stadiums so that everybody in society could be deliberating. They still, on a Hayekian view, simply wouldn't be able to understand all of the interactions that take place between the different elements of the social order. They still wouldn't know how the language is going to evolve. They still wouldn't know how the ideal pattern of resource allocation could evolve. The point that's being made here is that people, because of their cognitive limitations, cannot consciously strive for the common good. This isn't because they're too selfish, that they've got no concern for other individuals. It's simply because they cannot comprehend all of the factors that contribute to what that common good might actually entail. In a situation where people are limited in their cognitive capacities, we have to rely on institutions which allow for unintended consequences, where the evolution of society is an unintended byproduct of people responding to things like market signals, or responding to the evolution of language in the way that they do in unpredictable ways. It's not possible for people to know, even if you get them together in some kind of deliberative forum, how to design an ideal language. This is an example of what Hayek calls the synoptic delusion. The idea that if only you could have a committee meeting big enough, people would somehow know how society is going to evolve. This is a complete fiction on the Hayekian view. Okay, that's point number one, the synoptic delusion. But there's another problem with deliberation, which is arguably even deeper than this problem. It's the notion that the conception of learning that deliberative Democrats have, of how people learn, of how people's values changed, is actually a very impoverished one. They confine the notion of learning to acts of verbal deliberation, verbal reasoning, the type of process that I'm engaging in this room at the moment, or the type of process that you get in an academic seminar, where people argue with one another, and through the process of argument, of verbal discussion, they discover what the appropriate way of acting is or should be. Now, in the Hayekian view, there's a much more important way in which people learn. We learn, argues Hayek, more by observing what other people do and discovering through observation what turns out to be a better form of conduct than through explicit verbal argumentation. We learn by imitating the people who are successful and avoiding forms of action which are unsuccessful, even when, and this is the crucial point, we can't put into words what it is about a certain act which makes it successful or which makes it unsuccessful. There's a large amount of knowledge which Hayek and also the philosopher Michael Polanyi describe as being tacit knowledge. Knowledge which is crucial to action, but we can't actually put into words. If somebody tells you how to kick a football, you might not necessarily be able to do it. If you observe somebody else kicking a football, however, and you copy them, you copy what they're doing, then you might learn how to kick a football. Where if you just listen to the words, that isn't necessarily enough. A lot of social knowledge on the Hayekian view is communicated in this way. We observe people acting in a variety of ways, and we copy what works and avoid what doesn't work. Now, what matters on this point of view, if we're going to have an understanding of learning through action, is that there need to be enough nodes of action for people to be able to imitate. But this is precisely what deliberative democratic arrangements would choke off. Why? Because they're based on majoritarianism. They're based on the majority view being imposed on all. That's what social democracy is about. It's the notion that majorities will take the social decisions. Now, in a Hayekian view, majorities could turn out to be right, but majorities, as we know in many situations, often turn out to be wrong. So it's absolutely essential, if social learning is to occur, for minorities to be able to act, to have the freedom to act in contradiction to what the prevailing majority view is. People who are in the minority view, if they're given the freedom to experiment, to act in ways which are different from what the prevailing social wisdom is, then those people who are part of the majority can see alternative conceptions of reality coming to fruition and can learn to copy these forms of behaviour, which wouldn't necessarily be the case if the only thing the minority could do would be to rely on verbal persuasion. It's essential to be able to do what you believe, not just to talk about it. Because it's only through doing that other people can then learn from your experience. Now, what matters from this in the context of classical liberalism? Well, a market economy based on private property provides the maximum scope of doing rights, the capacity to do things without requesting the permission of some majority. It provides more scope for people to experiment, and therefore more nodes which can be imitated by other actors. It doesn't provide any guarantee of success, because many of these experiments will be failures. But it increases the chance that successful innovations will arise. Innovations which are simply not perceived by the prevailing majority view. It doesn't stop the majority acting out its views, but it equally doesn't preclude the minority acting in a way which is different from what the majority would prescribe. And that is the way, on the Hayekian view, that social learning takes place. Majoritarian institutions will squelch innovation. Now, do I have any evidence to support these claims? Well, there are three examples, empirical examples, which I would use to support the argument that I've just put forward. There's a lot of work being done on why worker cooperatives, which are based on some form of participatory democracy, it wouldn't be pure Habermas, but it's moving along those lines, are actually relatively unsuccessful enterprises compared to private businesses, institutions where people don't require a majority view necessarily. Worker cooperatives, it's generally agreed, even by people who advocate them, score very poorly when it comes to innovation. Insofar as they're successful at all, they're successful in lines of business where they're copying what conventional corporations already do. Things like washing machine manufacture is an example where some cooperatives are reasonably successful. But if you're talking about the generation of new ideas, new technologies, all these sorts of areas, worker cooperatives come way down the schedule. They're not innovative. This is no surprise from a Hayekian view, because they're majoritarian institutions. And most innovation comes about through people breaking from the conventional wisdom, whether we're talking about markets, or the arts, or science, or any other area where you have progress. It's minorities who strike out against the majority view. But worker cooperatives privilege the majority view over a minority view, which isn't the case in a private enterprise scenario, where an individual entrepreneur can go into a line of business having just persuaded a few people to support the enterprise, not having to have persuaded the whole population. Look at the field of civil rights. This is an area where I think you can make a case for markets. The market economy was already catering in areas such as music and recreation to different conceptions of, for example, gayness before you even had civil rights for homosexual people. There were already gay bars, gay clubs, gay music, gay art, all these types of things before the state had even recognised equality in terms of basic civil rights between gays and heterosexuals. This is an area where the market and civil society was running in advance of the state. It was challenging prejudices before the state. Another area, you look at race relations. There's a lot of evidence from the United States that whites who were most active in the civil rights movement were people who were of independent means, people who were independently wealthy and who were willing to stand out against racial prejudice, precisely because they had wealth. They didn't care what the majority of other white people thought about the fact that they were being traitors to the white race, in a sense. They were challenging the prejudice because they didn't have to kowtow to some prevailing majority view. That is an indication that it's not the majority view which necessarily leads to progress, but isolated minorities who have got the means to challenge the prejudices that exist in the social environment. Okay, now I want to make, before I go on to the moral argument and before I conclude, a brief note, possible criticism of the argument that I've just made. I'm making a claim here that markets facilitate diversity. I'm making a claim that markets facilitate the challenging of prejudice. That markets, in a sense, or a classical liberal society, is the antithesis of a herd-like society, where people just copy what everybody else is doing, en masse, because it provides room for experimentation. Now, some people might say, doesn't the recent financial crisis show that the argument that I've just made is complete nonsense? Because we do have herd behaviour, where people just follow the majority view in markets. You get panics, which can lead to irrational booms, and you can get panics which lead to, you get irrational exuberance which leads to booms, and panics which can lead to irrational slumps. I agree with this view. Markets can produce this kind of behaviour. It is possible for herd-like behaviour to exist in markets. The point that I'm making here is that there is nothing intrinsic to market institutions which precludes heterogeneity of behaviour. Although there's nothing to stop people behaving en masse like a crowd, there's nothing which instantiates this form of behaviour as a necessary part of the decision-making process. When we look at politics, on the other hand, social democracy, deliberative democracy, the institution that I'm challenging, it almost guarantees herd behaviour. Because one decision, the view of the majority, will always be imposed on a minority. At least markets provide some scope for minority entrepreneurs, as some banks did, not all, some, to act differently from what the rest of the crowd is doing. The most successful people in market environments are typically those who diverge from what the herd is doing. They sell when everybody else is buying, and they buy when everybody else is selling. They break from the minority view. Whereas in a deliberative democracy, it is the majority view that always counts, however wrong it may turn out to be. Okay, I want to go on to the final part of my argument, which is the moral part, the moral case for classical liberalism. The deliberative Democrats claim that their institutional environment secures equal respect, equal participation. You don't need to think very hard to recognise that this is complete nonsense. If you grant some ludicrous fantasy land where we can all go along to a Wembley Stadium to participate in all of these decisions which are going to be affecting us, then you might be able to construct some kind of case for deliberation. But in practice, people who advocate deliberation recognise that this is never going to work in practice. It's a logistical impossibility to have everybody participating in the deliberations. So what do? They collapse the argument back into a form of representative democracy. It's going to be political representatives who engage in deliberation, not the actual mass of the general public. Now, what does this mean in terms of equal respect? Well, in a market context, it's true that there isn't strict equality. The rich have got more options than the poor have. However, in a market environment where you can make your own decisions to buy and sell, both the rich and the poor, although the poor to a lesser extent, have got more scope to affect the decisions that will affect their lives than will be the case in a deliberative democracy, where representatives, political representatives, will be empowered in a way that no one has power to exercise decision-making authority over others in a market environment. It's deliberative democracy in a real, tangible form which will institutionalise inequality of respect. It's politicians who will have infinitely more power than anybody else in a society which makes decisions on this kind of a basis. So that's point number one. But there's another point here to make. People who are advocates of deliberative democracy will respond back to the argument that I've just made in the following way. They'll say that in order for deliberation to work effectively, it doesn't require, literally, that everybody participates in the decisions that are made. All that matters is that politicians are sufficiently public-spirited and that they will speak on behalf of all of the various interests that are present in society. So they'll speak, for example, on behalf of the poor. They'll speak on behalf of women. They will speak on behalf of gays and lesbians. They'll speak on behalf of religious minorities or racial minorities. That all of these different perspectives, all of these different notions of identity will be part of the mix because politicians can speak for these people. Now, what's the problem with this argument? It's a very profound one, and it goes back to the central claim that deliberative Democrats have about the nature of the individual self. Remember, they claim that the self shouldn't be seen to have some kind of fixed identity. It shouldn't be seen to have some kind of fixed notion of what its interests actually are. But if that is the case, then representative deliberative democracy is the worst form of decision-making you could possibly have. Why? Because in order to claim that you're representing women, or gay people, or black people, or Islamic people, or whatever the group might be, you have to assume that those labels actually correspond with a particular interest. But they don't, according to this whole argument. The notion of what it means to be a woman, of what it means to be a poor person, of what it means to be a gay person, what it means to be a black person, all of these are supposed to be fluid. There could be different views within the category of women of what it means to be a woman. There could be different views within the category gay of what it means to be a gay person. There could be different views within the category Islamic of what it means to be a Muslim. Inevitably, deliberative democracy in its representative form will resort to stereotypical views of what these communities are supposed to represent or what the interests of these communities are supposed to be. Yet this is the antithesis of what the deliberative Democrats are claiming society should be about. In a market environment, on the other hand, poor people, women, gays, blacks, Islamic people, all of the different groups or categorizations you care to mention, can act out their own conception of what their identity means to them in a far more variegated and nuanced way than would ever be possible in the context where deliberative representatives make decisions on their behalf. Final point in the criticism of the moral argument. Remember, the deliberative Democrats claim that if we bring people with conflicting viewpoints, conflicting preferences into a public forum where argument and debate is the major currency, that this will lead to greater respect for the other. That the more people hear one another's views, the more likely they are to respect one another. Excuse me, there are two problems with this argument. First of all, there's no reason to believe whatsoever that the more people argue with one another, the more they're likely to respect one another. My experience from academic seminars, though not necessarily the ones where I've been giving a speech, although maybe this may be different today, my experience is that the more people argue with one another, the more likely they are to become intolerant and to disrespect the views with whom they disagree. Although maybe that's just the particular academics that I'm used to dealing with on a daily basis. But I've had a reasonably wide experience of this, so I don't think it is. But there's another, more substantive point, which is based on a much larger empirical survey than the point that I've just made. The American political scientist Diana Mutz, who is no classical liberal, no libertarian, has done a lot of work looking at the character traits of people who are most likely to participate in politics. What kind of character traits do people who participate in politics have? And Mutz finds that people who are most likely to be politically active are the least tolerant people of all. Most people in their daily lives actually don't like talking about politics or controversial moral things. There are codes of behaviour where, okay, if you're with family or maybe close friends who share similar views, you might talk about politics. But if you're with people at work or you're talking to strangers, you just don't talk about politics out of politeness. The way you show respect for the other is not to talk about controversial moral positions. Equally, people who are tolerant are people who don't like the idea of imposing their own view of morality on other people. Now, these two traits, if you like, these traits of tolerance, it turns out on Diana Mutz's findings, are not the traits which are shared by politicians or people who engage in active pressure group politics. These are the kind of people who insulate themselves from any contact with people who disagree politically with themselves. They only talk to other lefties or other, whoever it may be, whatever political viewpoint that they happen to share. They only talk to people of like mind. Equally, they're the very people who wouldn't hesitate, because they're so convinced of their moral righteousness, to impose decisions against other people. They wouldn't hesitate to be intolerant in the way that they actually introduce the decisions that they're going to be taking part in. So what we have here, bearing in mind that deliberative Democrats advocate representative democracy, it turns out that the least tolerant people of all, the people who are least likely ever to change their mind on anything, are going to be the people who are supposed to be involved in this open-minded public argumentation where values and identity are open to flux and to change. What we would have is not a situation where those values prevail. We would have a situation, if we had more deliberation, that Hayek describes in The Road to Serfdom. Why the worst get on top. Politics selects for the people who are least tolerant and least susceptible to abide by these rules which deliberative Democrats advocate. Okay, concluding comments. I've argued in this talk that the understanding of the relationship between the individual and society that the deliberative Democrats expound has got much to commend it. I've also argued, however, that classical liberals and libertarians have got nothing to fear from this particular view of the world. I hope to have shown you this evening that if we recognise the genuinely nuanced relationship between the individual and society, far from seeing this as some kind of endorsement for collectivist forms of decision-making, we should see it as offering an opportunity to reinvigorate the case for political individualism, properly understood. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for one or two questions at most, if anyone would like to.
Okay, so I thought the question was really interesting, but I think possibly you've maybe missed the nature of co-decision making.
Okay.
So you can make an argument that we have to have some sort of decision making. Our decisions we have to make as a society affect us all. If we're going to make those decisions, then people in general shouldn't be allowed to impose their views on others.
Right.
If that's the case, we want people to be making arguments that are along the lines of they should affect everyone.
Yep.
And so Liberal Democrats say, well, if we'll talk about it, that'll be acknowledged that.
Yep.
And therefore, if we have to make these decisions, doesn't Deliberative Democracy offers the most plausible way of doing so in a way that will encourage people to have views that don't impose their views on others?
Okay, let me respond to this in the following way. First of all, I don't think that's what most deliberative Democrats claim. There are some who would make that argument. They might make the argument that if you have goods which are inherently collective goods, goods which wouldn't be supplied in a market, that we need some kind of political intervention to supply, then deliberation might be the most appropriate form of decision-making. I'm not necessarily unsympathetic to that view. That's not the claim that most deliberative Democrats make. Most of them, certainly the radical ones, people like John Dryzek, Iris Young, not so much Habermas in its current form, in its current mutation, but in his earlier life, they would claim that as many decisions as possible should be made through deliberative democratic processes. So goods which could be supplied in a market should be supplied through deliberative democracy. That's the argument that they would make. Now, there are more moderate ones who would make the kind of argument that you've put forward, which is that only if the market can't supply the good, maybe certain types of environmental good or what have you, should we resort to deliberation. You can make a case for that, but even in those cases, you can only access a public park in London if you're in London. You can only access the park in Oxford if you're in Oxford. So that would allow the authority in Oxford and the authority in London to have different policies in terms of how many public parks they choose to provide or what kind of parks they choose to provide. There'd be no implication in that case that there should be one decision made for society as a whole. You could allow the different jurisdictions to make their own decisions about which collective goods they supply, and then people can choose which area they want to live in terms of which bundle of goods most accords with a particular set of values that they have. Now that is more the kind of route I personally would go down if we're talking about most collective goods. Exit would still be the preferred principle because it would allow for more experimentation in this case in what kind of goods are provided and how they're provided. Only in an extreme case where it's inconceivable that the good could be provided on a relatively decentralized basis would I think that the argument for deliberation would come in. So if you're talking about something like dealing with climate change, for example, you could possibly make a case in that context as a last resort that deliberation might be the best way to go. But that would be very much recognising that it's a last resort, not the first resort, which is what most deliberative Democrats do.
One of the things you said at the beginning was that a criticism of classical liberalism and markets by deliberative Democrats is that it essentially allows people prejudices and moral beliefs about other people to go unchallenged.
Yeah.
Now, I think there might be something in that. I think markets per se, ignore racial characteristics and so on. They don't challenge prejudices, and in some cases they may, even if the prevailing view is such that, segregated on campus or what majority people want, they reward those views. So, given that we've seen in recent years an increase in tolerance towards minority groups, if it isn't due to markets, and it isn't due to argumentation, because you say argumentation makes people more tolerant, what are these things? What is it due to? You know?
Well, I disagree with you. I actually think it is due to market. I actually don't think there's any coincidence that a relative period of market liberalism throughout the 1980s and 1990s corresponded with a rise in tolerance towards sexual minorities, more progressive attitudes on race, these kind of things. Because this is an argument I didn't actually make in the talk. If people are acting in a commercial context, in general, they want to maximise the number of people who they can actually engage with commercially. There's going to be markets that cater to these people. Now, the very fact that people in many situations may be going out just for the pursuit of money means that they're going to be exposing themselves to groups that otherwise they might not have exposed themselves to. So a good example I'll give would be, I don't often quote the late Robin Cook, but he made a very good speech which went down in political history as being the chicken tikka masala speech, which is a speech where he claimed that the chicken tikka masala was the embodiment of the new multicultural society which was unfolding around us. And I kind of agreed with him about that. But that's a case where, if you like, people, for commercial reasons, Indian entrepreneurs in this case, are supplying a certain type of food, and very often drunk, ignorant, prejudiced British people turn up when they've rolled out of the pub into the Indian. Now, initially, I concede that many of those people would probably have had very nasty attitudes towards Indians, or they might have had racist prejudices. But having gone to the Indian on multiple occasions, they might have figured out, even though they were only going just for a quick bit of food after, because they were too pissed to do anything else, they would have gradually worked out, just by seeing these people, that, hey, actually they're just like us, or they are to a very significant extent. So it's the contact which is brought about purely for commercial reasons, which actually facilitates a greater degree of tolerance. If you'd have actually deliberately brought people together to have an argument about religion or culture, in the first place, which is what the Deliberative Democracy want to do, I don't think we would have had the same result.
With that, let's just thank Mark one more time. Thank